Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Mastering Retention Podcast. I'm Tom Hammond, your host and co-founder of UserWise. Today, we actually have another entrepreneur on with us today, Angus Lovitt, who comes to us from Ramp Growth, previously at King. Lots of fun stuff to dive into today. But Angus, before I really dive in, I always like to ask people, what's your story? Like, how'd you get into games, and then ultimately, where you're at today?
Well, I think this is a bit of a long one, so strap yourself in. So I'm a big gamer myself, by the way. Mostly AAA type stuff. I know there's a lot of podcast focuses a lot on free to play. I don't play a lot of free to play, and the reason for that isn't so much an objection to free to play itself. Obviously, that's my work and what I do. It's almost like when I play for escapism, and I don't want the magic removed by trying to second guess what the developer is doing as they're putting me through that loop. So I tend not to play a lot of free to play. And the second reason is also part of what I do is forecasting and making sure that marketing budget is spent efficiently. And I find actually not playing the titles in some ways removes me from that, and lets me be a little bit more objective about how that money is being spent, not overspent on a particular title because I happen to like it. And these sort of things. So that step removal actually, I think helps me a little bit in my career. But yeah, we go. So back to the question. The question was, how did I get into gaming? So my background is on performance marketing primarily. I worked at Starcom MediaVest, which is part of the Publicis Group. That's how I got my start in life. I got a call about 2009, 2010 from the CEO of King, Ricardo Zacconi. And he said, hey, I've heard of what you've done at the agency. I want you to come over here and join us at King. We have this cash gaming business, or this skill-based gaming business. If you're not familiar with that, it's skill-based gaming is, I put in $1, you put in $1. We play each other in a PvP type situation. The winner takes the $2 minus the house rate of 30%, much higher than gambling, and therefore and that was effectively the business model.
So like skills before skills.
That's right. My initial reaction was, I think I turned him down about 2 or 3 times, like literally to the point of hanging up on the guy. On the way through, and the recruiter, not just him. But they were very, very persistent, and they got me to agree to this meeting. So I go to their offices, coming from a big agency where I've got clients like Capital One, and I'm thinking I'm pretty hot shit working on these big brands, and I don't want to work for your little skill-based cash gaming / gambling business. That doesn't sound like it's for me. But I took the meeting, and I was really taken with this guy. It was just so inspiring and odd at the same time. So coming from a place which was very structured, I walk into this office, and there's Ricardo Zacconi, this Italian guy, very imposing figure, sitting behind quite a large desk, quite removed. So it's almost like a Godfather type situation that I'm walking into, and tells me a little about the business, tells me about the history and the founders, and said, okay, so when you fly to Sweden tomorrow to meet the rest of the founders, this is what I want you to do. And I'm like, Ricardo, I'm not flying to Sweden. We're in London, by the way.
Yeah.
Flying to Sweden tomorrow. I've got a job. I've got like stuff I have to take care of. And he's like, oh, I'm very, very, very sorry. That was very presumptuous and rude of me. How about the next day? So just to give you an idea of what this like. And I'm like, okay, fine. And I'll work it out. So I go get my tickets, And he goes, I'll swing by the office before you go get on your flight. So I go back into the office, and he's here. And the first thing he does, he picks up this duffel bag, a huge ass duffel bags, puts it at the side of the desk, and pushes it forward towards me, right? And then sits back down behind the desk. Then he continues talking about the founders and the history of these other things, but I'm not listening to what he's saying, because all I'm thinking is, what's in
the duffel bag?
I'm not taking your drugs. I'm not being your mule, you mafioso type. I'm not taking them to Sweden, right? And so I'm sitting here and I'm like totally distracted by this situation. And then he stops and then he looks at me and goes, you want to know what's in the bag, don't you? And I was like, yes, I want to know in the bag. He grabs this bag, he picks it up, he puts it on the desk and zips it open, right? Inside, there's 30 iPad 3G, like cellular connected type situation, the generation 1, right? Like 64 gigabyte, whatnot, 1,000 pound a piece or whatever it is here. First time I've ever seen one in my life, right? So here's this bag full of about 40,000 pounds worth of equipment, which I'm supposed to be taking over. And he said to me, I want you to take this to Sweden. I want you to hand them out to the employees of the company, and I want you to tell them that this is the future of the company, right? So very profound vision that he got, because this here tablet device is perfect for our casual audiences. I believe that this is how people are going to play, right? So that was crazy. But what was even more crazy was he was giving me this to a guy that he's hardly met, an employee which has, second interview, not even working at the company. So fast forward like four or 5 hours on the next day or whatever, I'm passing out these iPads to these people like Father Christmas. Like looking at me like, who are you? And I'm like, I don't know. I just don't know. So I found that completely crazy experience. Oh, by the way, on the elevator, he kind of smacks me on the rear end. I'm not sure if you can do that these days. And he said, by the way, keep one for yourself. Just the completely unique experience to where I'd come from in the agency, just to have that freewheeling kind of attitude, to that motivation to inspire the people which were around him, and to make those quick decisions, as well as having that broader vision of, hey, don't know exactly how we're going to get there, but this is the direction, this is where the customer is heading, and this is where we're going to go. So I found that particularly powerful. So anyway, after the founders, I had a dinner with the founders. He calls me up and he said, "Okay, so when you start, here are the 5 different things that I want you to do." And I'm like, "Ricardo, you haven't even offered me a drop." And he goes, "What do you want?" I'll double your salary or something stupid like that. And I was like, "Well, okay, if you're going to do that." So I started. So I guess it wasn't I joined King not because of gaming or any big vision that I had or anything necessary about the company, but because, there was this real visionary, entrepreneurial type spirit. And I found that very infectious from the first few meetings. I thought that would be an amazing sort of career change. So that's how I got into gaming, into King, in the first place. Yeah.
So now tell me a little bit about Ramp. Like, how did that kind of come about, and what sort of services are you offering to game studios these days?
So Ramp came about largely down to, obviously, me from previous stories I've been telling about how powerful forecasting can be and transforming it could be for the business, but also how poor and how little attention that most most companies and most gaming studios actually pay to it. It's just so often, when budgets or games don't meet expectations, it wasn't necessarily down to the game, it was down to the poor forecasting. So I guess Ramp came from a personal struggle of, I was staying late at night, working on these spreadsheets, forecasting whole games, portfolios of games via cohort-based forecasting in spreadsheets. Very cumbersome to do and do well. And I thought there must be a better way than this. So effectively, Ramp is predictive analytics. We forecast users and revenue, primarily for, I guess, our target market would be FP&A teams within gaming studios. It works outside of gaming too, but we've obviously got quite a few studios that we work with. And it does user and revenue forecasting as the primary thing for games as a whole. Then in addition to that, it does ROAS, LTV calculation, ROAS monitoring, and validation. Obviously very important to do, as well as helps you do scenario planning. Okay, so what happens, for example, if we increase the monetization of our game by X, or the retention by Y after this point, or what happens if we increase our marketing spend in this way? A very quick way for you to go and analyze these decisions quickly, or at least far more quickly than what a spreadsheet would allow. So that's Ramp, and there's other features too, hopefully, that we're going to build in, which are very useful for gaming companies. One is a feature I call triage, which is, far too often when you've got a live operating game, the numbers will drop, and everyone.
I was going to ask you about that.
The numbers will go, people will go scurrying, right? So this is the thing, shit, the numbers are dropped. So you send your best people, the heads of all the departments, on this big triage type exercise. And, and ultimately what it comes down to, like probably most of the time, is the forecast was wrong. Wasn't anything. We should have anticipated this. We should have expected this. And so what this feature, I'm hoping, will do is say, okay, this is the date when things were going well. This is the date that wasn't. Here are the key pillars, of retention, monetization, and obviously at the life stages, it might be like day one, day through D65. Here's what changed versus the expectation between these two dates, and what was the value? What was the value on that in terms of, because that's the only way it becomes tangible. You can't say an X% drop. You can't say it dropped from 30% day 2 to day X. What does that mean in terms of total business value? What I want to do is put a dollar figure to it. So, hey, that means that we're going to miss our target by 2 million, 3 million, by the end of the year. There's this issue here. This is the gap of expectation. This is the metric. And to enable you to it won't give you all the answers, at least not in its first incarnation, to hone in on that and understand the size of the impact of the issue which is at play. And that's if there is an issue. If the forecasting is correct in the first place, there shouldn't be an issue whatsoever. So, for example, a lot of the times when I've been through in that situation, it's come down to seasonality, right? So, numbers are down. Oh, well, it was a holiday in the US, right? It's not here in the UK or in whatever. So you're not thinking about, panic stations, but actually there was a holiday. And so, well, actually numbers probably went up on that case, but maybe it was a sunny day or something where people didn't play the game. And so what our tool does, or what our platform does, is actually mimics that seasonality to start, to actually forecast that properly in the first place. So that's pretty cool. The other thing it allows you to do, another cool feature that we're building in too, is about live operations and events. So it's very a lot of the things that we struggle with, I'm thinking back at early days at King, what are the events that we're running? What is the cadence that we should be doing it? What's the cost reward for doing those features? What priorities should we be doing them? What is the long-term impact on the game economy? All these sort of interesting questions. And so what we're building is a feature where you can basically just be tagging events, right? This has happened between this state. And you can have multiple events live. And what we can do is run machine learning on that, pass out, the sort of events. And then we can do the output of that will be two things. Number one, okay, this is the sort of value of running these events. But also two is if your game is very live op driven, then you should be mimicking that within your forecasting and seasonality. And increasingly, as gaming companies get better at this, they are. So you should be attempting to go and do that. So that's pretty cool. So effectively, it's taking this world of forecasting, all that stuff in the spreadsheets, which is very cumbersome to the point where people just don't do it, even though they should, to a world where it's connected, always on, and is based in machine learning. And having that sort of, I guess, crystal ball at your fingertips, can be really, really powerful. Help you prioritize. Yeah.
And I don't think that this is just like, I think this is a pretty serious problem because, if you get your forecasting wrong, which, you're literally just playing with numbers in a spreadsheet. And if you get your forecasting wrong and you're spending millions of dollars of UA funds and your payback time is wrong by 6 months, or maybe it's never going to get there, or your LTV is wrong, like you could just lose all that money. So, it is a very, very risky, thing to get wrong, I think. UA is obviously the biggest expense at any studio. So I think spending it right is the important thing for studios to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So the crime is if you're over investing to the point where you're creating value destruction within that. So when you're, particularly today, when studios are investing like six to 12, 18 months, 2-year payback, small variances can mean that the payback can go infinite. That's true value destruction. You'll never get that back. Why do you do that? So that's criminal. That's negligent. There's no reason you should be going and doing that. And then you've got the converse situation. If you're sitting on a really good title and you're not able to justify, mathematically to your CFO or CEO that you should be spending more money on this, then that is, and the game is not reaching its full potential, and you're leaving money on the table because of that. That's equally as criminal. So, finding that right level and having the tool sets to go and make those arguments is really, really important, and that's what we provide.
That's great. And I know you sort of talked about this a little bit, but do you guys do any sort of like ongoing monitoring of like your ROAS or CPAs or LTVs or something? Like if something, I had predicted this and I thought it was here and suddenly, numbers are tanking. Obviously you might see that elsewhere, but.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what we are, what we do, but we're continuing to build in the platform is one of the important things is to constantly be reviewing your own work. Now, obviously that's hard, right? So if I make a prediction two weeks ago that my LTV was going to be $1, and all of a sudden I hit at ROAS because the LTV, I don't hit my ROAS numbers because the LTV prediction, came in at, or the actuals came in at 80 cents or whatever. That's pretty dangerous sort of stuff, particularly when you're spending at scale. So you should be constantly reviewing the accuracy of your own modeling and being able to explain if your ROAS is different to what you expect it to be, or your payback is different, why? Was it my CPA has gone up more than expected? Was it because my LTV prediction has gone down? If my LTV prediction has gone down, why is that? Is it basically, has monetization dropped? Is it because the retention curve has altered? All these different things, the ability to continually monitor and explain what's going on over time is super important to do. But often, the UA people, finance people, who are given the task to go do this, they're the last in line for development resources. They never get this, so they never get cool shit built for them. So what I realized is I had to go and build it myself. So basically, this is the tool that I'm building for myself, but that no one else would build for me.
I love it. Yeah. That's great. I'm curious, like, what was it like in the earlier days at King, like right as, let's say Candy Crush was launching? Like, tell me about the UA environment, back then.
Yeah, so I think, as I may have mentioned earlier, very different environment back in 2000 and I think 12 is when Candy Crush launched. So obviously, number one, we had a run of the field when it came to the available inventory. There was no other application that really truly monetized on the App Store, and therefore we had that first mover advantage there. Our paybacks, or we could afford to have paybacks, which were super quick. So that's one thing. I think the landscape was very different in terms of discoverability and virality. So if you cast your mind back even further to the likes of when Zynga created Farmville, that was a game that was truly viral. It was connected to via the Facebook platform. They would have spent very little on marketing at least to get it to where it was initially. So it would have had a K factor, which was above 1 by definition, right? When Candy Crush came along, we had a K factor that was, I'm not sure if this is protected information, but it was about 0.7. So that means for every user that we got back in 2012, we got an additional 2.3 for free. So that's massive. That's massive. So if you work that back in, which we did, to what we could afford to pay for a user, you can understand how the environment is very different to where it is today. So what I'm seeing across a lot of different clients is if you don't have the benefit of a pre-existing IP, you'd be lucky to get a free to paid ratio in your advertising, like of more than 10% organic. Organic consisting of virality and basically misattribution usually, but and that's the reality today. We used to have things like Open Graph on Facebook, which basically gave free inventory. We used to have the App Store. People used to go to them because people used to use that as a place to fill up their phones. Okay, what can I download? Nobody's doing that. To the same. Well, I'm sure in absolute volumes they are, but relatively speaking, they're not. And then, so the discoverability and virality component obviously is a much different landscape to where we are today. And obviously, we've got none of the problems that we have regarding IDFA and all that goodness, which has come in quite recently. So very different marketing landscape from where it is today, definitely.
Interesting. Yeah, that's crazy. I had no idea it was like that back then.
Just the eCPMs, back to the first point, right?
Yeah.
The eCPMs have gone up, and this is where I'm going to go into rant mode, right? Like, yep. So eCPMs have gone up. Obviously, I think at one stage I was looking at graphs as like that. It's like 70% year-on-year compounding for whatever. So the eCPMs on advertising are so expensive, and what the payback period, what I'm seeing, in people that I talk to, all that's happened is that the paybacks have just pushed out and out and out, to the point where it's ridiculous. It is truly ridiculous, the sort of paybacks that the companies are actually paying it, and there's no logic sometimes behind why they're even doing that in the first place. Too seldom companies are asking themselves why they're doing what they're doing. So, some of the answers I get, well, because that's what you need to be competitive. That's not a real answer. The correct way to think about it is what is right for us and for our business. And if spending less money and making things more efficient is the right thing to increase shareholder value and the long-term prospects of your game, that's what you should be doing, rather than artificially pumping those numbers. And I think people don't really think about that enough. And that's one of the things that we do, or I work a lot on, is helping people answer that question. How much should we be spending? What's the right level, the optimum level of marketing business for us?
Yeah. Is a lot of that related to like the profitability that you need to have at your studio so that you can afford salaries and hiring goals and all those kind of things?
Absolutely. So the way to think about it is there is decreasing efficiency with the more you spend. So the decreasing efficiency comes from two areas. The first is, as obviously you've got increasing CPIs, and therefore your cost per incremental is going up as you're spending more money. So it's becoming more expensive the more volume you're trying to get, that price volume curve relationship. The second is, as you increase your marketing spend, the way that the algorithms are working is that you're getting less and less warm users, and the quality of those users or the metrics of those users are going down. And we call that cohort cooling, which is effectively the opposite of the golden cohort effect, right?
Right.
Cohort cooling is generated by two things. It is how far you have eaten into your total addressable market, how many more players have I got to get, but also the speed at which you're doing it. And that can degrade the quality. What you can do very early on, which is fundamental to all our modeling, is look at these two things and say, you can actually pick where the game's going to plateau, where it's going to peak out, because you can see some of those underlying trends in the data set for a lot of these games. So my point being is, it's all about that cost per increment. What's the incrementality? What's the impact on our overall revenue from moving from a 12-month to a 16-month or a six months? And what is the opportunity cost for us of actually doing it? If we've got staff which are underpaid, if we've got a high churn rate within our studio, people are begging to get paid more, or we need more people to build these amazing features to do this. What do you think is going to be better for the game, in the medium and longer term, and even the shorter term in some instances? Is if you can make it more efficient, then you've got the flexibility to make other decisions, just rather than getting on that UA hamster wheel, running that rat race. And so, whereas when I was coming up, in my formative UA youth, I was trying to encourage people to spend more by justifying that spend, saying you're going to make it back, and you're going to make it back quickly. Now, what I'm doing for the most part is mostly the opposite of that, which is, wow, like, hey, you can reduce your marketing budget by half, and your gross bookings are only going to reduce by 15-20%. But you're going to be instantly profitable, and or you can make these future investments, and or da-da-da. And by the way, you also assume far less risk. Because when you're spending money, when you're putting that money out there, and there's a long payback period, a lot of things can happen in the interim. So I'm going to give you a very specific example of this. In 2010, I'm going to call it 2010, we had, so Bubble Witch Saga was one of the games. It was effectively and cynically cloned by Zynga. Basically the player base of that game fell out pretty rapidly over the space of 2 or 3 weeks. Now, at that time, the payback periods for that game were very short. So, the impact of that obviously wouldn't have financially crippled a company, or you wouldn't have wasted a bunch of money. But imagine if you were running at what they are today, a 12 or 6 month, an 18 or 2 years, or I've even heard companies go to, and you're doing that way, and you just invested millions of dollars, which you will never get back. That's crazy, and that's very real prospect that can happen. So when you're putting it out there, I think people often don't counter into the risks of competitive movement in between the time that you spend the money and when you're going to go and make that money back. On top of, it's so much more difficult to forecast that cumulative revenue curve up to 2 years in the future. So if you get that wrong, like marginally, like by fractions of percentage, that can push your payback out infinite, true value destruction. You're never going to make that money back. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that and encouraging people to really think about, making the right decisions for their studios, for their business, about what that optimum level of spend is going to be.
Yeah. Do you have any, like, for, maybe studio leaders that are thinking about it, like, do you have any general, like, rules or processes of like, here's where I typically think most studios should, like, maybe be for XYZ reasons, or, here's some things that you should be thinking through? Because I think a lot of it is just, we just got to grow.
So there is nothing, look, modeling some of this is why, we've created a platform for forecasting and modeling. Now, you don't even need to use something as sophisticated as what we've built. I hope you do, but at least try to do it. This is a mathematical game. A lot of people just don't put in their homework. You should be able to construct a mathematically based argument of, if we spend this much money, this is what we think is going to be the outcome. If we do that, and factor in a diminishing return, even if you don't know exactly what it is, do it, try it. Like, just put that diminishing return factor in and see what happens, and see how that would impact your decision making. So the advice is not where will it be, it's like, in advance of spending money, you should always, UA budget, you should always have an idea of what's going to happen. It doesn't necessarily need to be right. Hopefully it's directionally accurate, but I just think that that's good governance. So making sure that you have a good idea of what's going to happen before you actually go do it, by putting in the homework, before that happens, I think is the primary advice that I'd like to give. And the other one is, and that's not relating just to UA. I think I've been involved in a ton of soft launches over my time, and I think the same kind of advice applies to that, right? So too often, the targets that, I guess, okay, we're going to create a game in X genre. Yeah, this is the sort of targets we're aiming for, but there's been no homework in terms of, okay, this is how big we think the game will be. This is the metrics that we need to get there to make it commercially viable. And the way to do that is ultimately to backtrack from, okay, you need to make the assumption you need to buy all your users. That's fact, because discovery is dead. So that's fact. So you need to pay, if you're in a genre of, just say casual, or puzzle, a good game will be paying, between $10 and $20 in the US for on iOS, for example, right? If you're not getting there, and look, maybe a bit of survival bias here, people, because I've dealt with some big people, but if you're not getting there, if you can't make a logical argument how you're going to get to those numbers, then you do not have a commercially viable game. And so you could do that from day dot before writing your first line of code. And so what happens, I find, is that, we put the work in, we come out of soft launch, and then we've got a certain set of associated metrics. But then, because the targets were ill-defined to begin with, then those sort of that game development process gets dragged out when it should be killed a lot earlier in the cycle. I've very rarely seen, retention improve, I don't know, like more than say 10, 20% out of soft launch. And I'm obviously not talking about long-term retention as you're building out the meta and everything else. But those initial numbers stick. And I've never seen monetization, once you get your monetization, by increased by more. I want to give that a broader range, more than like 50, 100%. So what I don't quite understand is how some of these games are allowed to continue in that soft launch period for as long as they are, when there's so little likelihood of them actually succeeding and becoming commercially viable. And I think there just has to be a better way to fail faster than I think most of the gaming companies.
So let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question here, because there's so many companies that I know that are stuck in this soft launch hell right now and trying to figure out it's so close to being, commercially viable or XYZ. If you and I had to go start a game studio today, we've got a great game team, all the artists, all the developers, we got all the people, which isn't to say that's easy to do. I think that's pretty hard too. But, we need to go and soft launch a game. And ideally, this is going to be a successful game. Like, how would you soft launch a game today?
So, look, I mean, a lot of it isn't going to come as a surprise in terms of the steps, which is, depending on your category. Look, some games obviously has it easier than others. It's obviously, if you've got your core loop in place, it's obviously easier to do a puzzle game and get it out in one of the lower monetizing but higher volume Southeast Asian countries to get a view of that retention curve. One of the things that people need to understand, by the way, about that retention curve is that it doesn't differ significantly to retention curves anywhere else. So don't be like, oh, well, if only it was in the United States or Australia or anywhere else, unless there is a mechanical problem, okay, our CDN or there's something wrong with the game, it's going to be marginally off. Or the other thing that can change it is IP. So if it's a super strong IP that is not, known, so often Japan has crazy outlier retention metrics for a lot of games that I see, because they've used a local IP, which is a lot stronger in the market. But for the most part, if you've just got a new game without that IP, that is going to be, your retention curve pretty much locked those metrics out the gate. So going through that geo-lock soft launch process, is good, and spending as much time in that lower cost environment as possible. Because what I'm also seeing, and this isn't a newsflash, is that just to get out the gate, just to buy enough users to be data sufficient to even get a view of that retention curve in the first place, or that monetization, is really, really difficult. Super expensive. What I would say is, or where I'm coming in is, I think once you've made it out of that and you do have a good view, I think a lot of people drink their own Kool-Aid with the games. And if only we did this, if only we did that, if only we did that. But it's very hard once you've kind of set down that soft launch to make these huge strides, of more than 100%, like doubling entire metrics. And I think you've got to be more honest with yourself out that gate is, are we going to get there? So maintaining the team size as small as possible for as long as possible, maintaining in those metric environments for as long as possible before incurring any costs. And then, if you refer back to the plan that you just said, the advice number one, we're not there yet. We've given it X months. We made this assumption, this assumption, this assumption about how these features were going to increase it by X. None of them panned out. What makes you think that idea 6, 7, or 8 in the rank is actually going to do that as opposed to your first instinct? So killing the games sooner and moving on. And now a lot of smaller studios may not have that luxury. I understand that, but at the same time, spending longer, and not making that very hard decision to put a game down or to sunset it, I think is very costly. Not just for smaller studios, but larger ones. I mean, Tom, can you think of too many which were terrible soft launches or even terrible launches that have turned into world beaters? I think Coinmaster is the class example of something which was in the market for a very long time and then had an exponential growth curve. Do you know any off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, no.
Do you have a community? Right. I want to know. I want examples of games that have been in soft launch, that were terrible, or even if they're just internal ones that have managed to be turned around. I think it happens too infrequently. So anyway, have I actually answered the question in all this? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I have advice. Go through those steps. Kill them sooner, but backtrack it. Always backtrack it from the assumption that you need to pay, because you cannot rely on discovery. You cannot rely on virality. It doesn't really exist before unless you get extremely lucky. So in your business modeling, you can't assume that, or at least not in a sustainable way. Even if you do get a big viral hit, or you get an app feature, relying on app features is not a sustainable business model. You get that, then what happens? Yep. How is that going to help you? And that was even advice from 3 or 4 years ago when they were big, which is, you get developers which whole mindset was about chasing those app store features, or trying to game the system or whatnot. And that's what they spent their time doing, rather than doing something which was sustainable and repeatable.
Do you see, I know some people have different processes for how they come up with game ideas and validate them. So, some are like, give me 30 seconds of real gameplay, and I want to get that as an ad on Facebook as soon as possible to see what's the CPI. Do you find that those kinds of things are successful? I know historically, usually once you get your CPI, it only goes up from there as you get past your golden cohort. And so I'm curious, what your take is on validating game ideas and stuff. Yeah.
I think that should be part of the green light process, as part of the validation of any playbook, right? That you have. I think that's one of the things. I don't think it's the be all and end all of things, because and here's a hot tip. Here's where this can this method can fall down. Rule number 1 is different things happen at scale as opposed to smaller, right? So the tangible example of that is when we used to do similar testing at King back in the day. And what we would find, because the algorithms at small would provide very different response rates. Okay, super high, this is the creative, this is the theme, we're going to run with this or whatnot. But then what might happen is you've gone and created something that you've appealed to a very niche, rabid fan base with very high metrics. And then what happens when you scale that, by definition, you need to become more broadly appealing. So, so actually using the same creative when you actually push go might not be or theme might not be the best to do. So I think it's something which is directional, but I don't think that it is a very good, and this is coming from marketing. Obviously, I want good CPIs, I want good themes, but I don't think that's a very good way of game making per se, is to think solely marketing, or always think marketing first, but solely UA first. I think that's one validation within the list. I think, increasingly, there's two ways to do it. Either you're creating something which is truly unique, and is standing out. And so you've got a core, core gameplay loop, or there's something unique about your game which makes it stand out above the crowd. And it doesn't necessarily think, tactile, brilliant. If you're familiar with tactile and the way that they use narrative and the way that threaded through some of the UA. So that's one way of doing it. Finding that, what is our USP? What are we doing? What makes us special? So that it's a sustainable thing going forward. The other way is, I think, more what I like to call optimizers. So some people are just so in tune with these features. I could do that feature better. I could, I understand that feature is the key thing that increases this metric, and therefore I'm going to take this from here. But you need to be really good. You need to have really good product people to do that. I think Dream is a really good example. Dream Games is a really good example of, just some hardcore product focused people, just geniuses. That nothing they do is 100% hey. But they do it best and more polished and more refined, and they've cobbled it together with world-class live ops and things like this. Then, I think they're a good example of that sort of mentality. But if you're stuck in the middle of those two things, then you're in no man's land, right? so you're just vanilla, and there's no reason to play. So I think it's like choose your own adventure there. That's how I think about it.
Makes sense. Cool. Well, I know we're getting shy on time here. I'm curious, just maybe like final question. What sort of challenges do you see facing games today from a UA perspective? And do you have any, good insights on how studios should be thinking about taking those on today?
Yeah, sure. So obviously just the immediate challenges, which I'm not going to go into, everyone would have spoken about IDFA to death. Attribution will continue to be an issue. I could do a whole podcast about how angry I am about Apple, about this way that was handled, and how angry I am frankly, at all developers for not having a more united front to be able to negotiate. I just don't understand how we managed to, collectively allow, a subpar solution thrust upon us in that manner. I think everyone was just too scared. Keep your heads down. She'll be right. And ultimately, it wasn't. I would like to think that the developers as an industry have taken some lessons from that. And this isn't about being hostile or anything like that. It's just like, how do we collectively communicate these concerns that we have about, things that we rely on, about how we're going to grow into the future, in a more effective and constructive and visible manner. And really frustrated about that whole thing, from a personal, professional and fresher standpoint. You don't want to go, I don't want to spend the next 2 or 3 years of my life solving issues which were previously solved. Trying to crack attribution. How annoying is that? Rather than pushing things forward. Imagine what my life would be. Thankfully, I'm going to leave that to smarter people than myself to try and crack. But that annoys me. So IDFA, rising eCPMs. How do we address that now? And I think whereas I was very anti-IP coming up, survival bias, Candy Crush. It was a new IP. We've obviously got more money to play with. I think increasingly having that base to build from, if you have the right contractual arrangement in place with the IP owner, so that you can continue to spend on UA, and there's a healthy relationship with the partner. And there's been many examples of a more healthy relationship. I think Scopely's probably got quite a few, I think, from their heritage. Whereas that's not the case always. Understand that it's a perpetual UA machine, and you need to continue that, and you're going to share that cost, I think is in getting that right is important. So that's one way to kind of get around that. I think understanding that the power of networks. So actually, you know what, I'm gonna switch up here. I'm gonna go here.
Love it.
Got it written down. These are my top 10 or top 7 tips. Let's call it 7. I'll stop at 7. Top 7 tips for marketers, right? Okay, number 1, get the right people in place. So, performance marketing, by definition, is a process of test, learn, and refine. And to do that well, you need people with natural curiosity, because it's in the process. It's like, test and learn, like test. And there's somehow, like, there just isn't natural, this is what the numbers say, it didn't work, and that sort of, you need to be constantly have this perpetual attitude of overturning stones. Obviously, some people are limited by their game or the product they're working with in terms of the yield that's creating or whatnot. But always that healthy appetite to learn. You need people which understand nuance and don't speak in absolute certainties regarding their situation, because what will apply elsewhere may not apply to you. What applies at a small scale does not apply to a large scale. So you need people which understand this. There's not one right way. It's we're going to test this, and does it apply to us? And we're going to test it rigorously. Does it apply to us? You need people that understand what good looks like. So most people in marketing have come up from an agency, and they're trained to spin. And there's nothing more damaging than post-justifying bad performance, right? And saying, somehow gaslighting and saying it was good. So marketers need to know what the goods look like. If they're not writing their own, the targets aren't given to them properly, that's often half the problem. But post-justifying is very, 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 very damaging. And you need to make it clear, and there needs to be an environment of trust created within the UA people that, hey, it's okay not to hit your volumes, just don't waste my money, right? That there needs to be the mantra, right? And so good companies, all the great UA companies, you can tell when there's a well-oiled machine, because their ROAS targets will remain, or payback period rather, will remain entirely constant in any situation, because they're constantly adjusting up and down to that situation. That's a well-oiled UA enterprise. And I think in terms of hiring, I think a lot of people can say, oh yeah, I can manage a Facebook campaign. I can do this, I can do that. But the question is, have they done it at scale, right? Obviously not everybody in the team needs to have done that. You obviously need juniors, and you need a hierarchy of people which are learning and whatnot. But it's a very different situation if you're in the gutter to when you're consistently spending, because you're trying to hack your way out of something at a lower level, and often those sort of strategies aren't sustainable as when you've got this machine which is up and running and you're constantly spending to certain targets. So that was number 1, get the right people in place. You're going to have 2 hours of content on them. I'm sorry.
No, this is great.
Number 2 is, set your strategic objectives up front. I'm talking about the high level stuff. So let's have a conversation about brand, right? Like, you'd be surprised at how many of the gaming studios don't even have like a brand playbook, like, okay, this is our ident, this is how we speak to consumers, the tone of voice, even broad things like, this is how we think about, are we willing to invest in brand because there's in terms of media, short-term, long-term, how much? What are the objectives for those? If you do spend media money for brand objectives, what are the objectives of that? It's not just brand money. It needs, it doesn't go in a separate bucket, which is unaccountable. What are the specific metrics and they can be longer term, they can be softer, but what are you trying to hit so that they're held accountable for that spend.
Yeah.
In terms of UA, what is the right payback period for your organization? We've talked about that before. What is your appetite for risk? What if it goes wrong? Do we know our price volume curve? What happens to our quality scale? So the sort of stuff that I talked about before. So even before you get into, these sort of lower level stuff, having those discussions up front and center so that you set the expectation. Number 3, be agnostic with your marketing spend. So you always invest to maximize return. It seems simple, but you'd be amazed at how many different companies, not just gaming don't do this. So basically, hey, a lot of the classic one is, we're only going to invest in US because they've got higher monetizing users, which is just, mind-bogglingly silly because if you think that the more you spend within a certain segment, the less efficient it is. So if you've got a fixed marketing budget, you should be distributing that evenly across geographies. You should be splitting it across, networks. You should be splitting across, and everything's to the same parameter. Doesn't mean that, hey, we can't have a multifaceted marketing campaign with different things running, and that I'm not saying that they won't work better in concert. I'm just saying you don't make arbitrary excuses to favor one thing over another. Yeah. Number 4, set good targets. So what a CPA target, I like to work in terms of CPA targets rather than ROAS targets. A CPA should represent what that customer is worth to you as a company, dollar in, dollar out. So that means making sure that you capture as much of that value as possible. So where does the value come from? It comes from in-app purchases. It comes from ad revenue. It comes from upsell from merchandising. It comes from cross-sell to other games. It comes from virality. You need to convert that to a figure, if you're doing this properly, which is a dollar in, dollar out situation as much as you possibly can. It's hard, but you need to do it, or at least think about it, to do some of these correctly, because either you're over-investing or you're under-investing, one of the two situations, and you want to get it spot on. Number 5.
Yeah.
Number 5, robust test and learn. You should be constantly seeking to get new partners on the plan. A lot of the things is okay, well, classic one for new studios is we're going to do Facebook and Google, and we're going to stop there because they're 80% of the market. We're going to just concentrate on those because we've got limited manpower, yada, yada. I mean, if that were true, then you'd be missing out on Unity and Bungle and all these other networks, which comprise the majority of gaming. Different genres work differently across the other ones. So you should be testing and learning. And that extends to offline methods as well. So, back in the day at King, we were spending 100 million plus a year just on TV alone. Now, I'm not sure if that's possible to do in this day and age. Obviously, perfect storm back then. But the offline media works. There is no brand that's been built from banner ads alone. So constantly testing those sort of things. And so we've got IP-driven TV is, I think, my advice would be, if you want a new kind of like where people are going to grow, if you manage to crack that, because we've got a whole industry which has moved from like kind of offline and it's started to move online. That's and it's a low eCPM, so the whole thing's starting again. That's the way to think about it. There's a platform shift. So if you can be constantly doing that and trying to crack that and make that scalable for you, that is something which is scalable and systemic going forward, because that inventory is there and it's only going to increase going forward. So if you can make that work for you, that's something that you should be doing. But whatever you do, make sure it's scalable and repeatable. For example, influencers. Not a huge fan. Maybe a bit of survival bias because I haven't seen excellent examples of that truly be held to account. But I just don't see it as properly. It could have scale, no doubt, but is it repeatable? Are we going to, be able to get that up and running and repeat it for the next campaign? And if it works the next time, and maybe you've got an influencer, maybe they want more money and yada, yada, yada. So I'm not saying it's not part of the mix, but would it be where I'm going to spend my time, focusing on when I've got so many hours in the day? Probably not. And I think that maybe the last one, just to finish off on, is, and it probably is obvious these days, but a robust creative pipeline, particularly for when it comes to performance marketing, is just so important, more important than ever. It used to be, when I was coming through, that the way you spent the money, how you spent it, and the networks and who was spending it would be the largest of the difference of whether your campaigns were working, or difference between good and bad. As people have got better, as people have got more skilled at their jobs, as the algorithms do much of the heavy lifting within the campaigns themselves, a lot of that kind of competitive advantage you have by being really good at performance marketing is eroded. And what's left, the competitive advantage comes from, your creative, both, the quality of it, the volume of it, and the messaging within it. So making sure that moving from a place where you're doing individual briefs to creative agencies, and they're coming back and they've got one set of creative, and you just need this pipeline of constant, I need 100 creative a month and 3 themes. And so there's this persistent pipeline and a military style structure of getting those in and having those available, to stop the degradation in the CTRs and CTIs that occur from leaving the creative there too long. Making sure that you're utilizing AI as much as possible, and these new AI solutions which are coming up as part of that as well. And the last thing on creative, I think, is understanding the quality investment trade-off. So, there comes a time where if you are underinvesting in your creative, and you're spending it, let me put it another way. It's far easier to push a button and spend another $1 million, another $2 million by pressing a button and changing your bids, than it is to do another creative, and that could increase performance by the same amount. And all too often, that's what tends to happen, is we spend more money inefficiently rather than actually getting the hard yards in and getting that creative in, and spending more money and more quality to increase the quality. So there's cost trade-offs at different levels of spend. So, 10,000, if just say you're creating a TV ad, let's make it real simple, 10,000, creating a TV ad, you can do it for $10,000. And that might be good if you've got 100,000, spending 100,000, 150,000 in media. But at a certain point, if you start to spend 3 million or whatnot, it's the same thing, that getting that incremental, spend that incremental bit on creative budget, ultimately makes sense, because you're boosting it across, a much larger marketing budget, or you're deploying it across much. So understand that cost quality trade-off. And I think the poor marketing and the poor branding people, often the poor cousins in the marketing department too often, I think, in this day and age, because it's just I think it's just so much easier to understand, and measure the UA spend, and it's in the system, and so as much as possible, try to make that justification that branding as a whole, and that quality creative and a systematic, robust pipeline is worth investing in it. So I think that's the last point.
Final question there, and you hit on a good point. It's easier to rely on the AI solutions or whatnot than like making new creative. Do you know, or do you have any way to know, like, when a creative is maybe toward the end of its life, or needs a replacement coming up, or you need to scale it back?
Yeah, so that it's interesting. So I'm obviously not in the interfaces myself these days. So I probably would need to bring in some of these guys and to speak to the more specific points. But guys and girls, but the way that, say, take Facebook for example, what we tend to do is, or and a lot of people do different things. So a lot of people have test buckets where they're like, it's a test account, and we're doing this. We find this, if you have one campaign, which is your, just call it your stable campaign that you're running, your business as usual one that you spend most of the money from, we find that often weird things happen if you carve off a little shitty one and you're stopping and starting and you're putting that in a separate bucket, and measuring that and getting the best results out of that often is the best. So I'm very much still a survival of the fittest type person, which is, chuck creatives in with the existing creative and see if they can swim. So I don't think there's any right answer in terms of when you should take it down. I think in terms of an absolute time, the right answer is when you got something better. So that's why your robust pipeline needs to be in there. So you're just constantly feeding in, and trickle feeding your best creatives into that master group, seeing what survives and what doesn't. And that's very high level. Obviously, it's different for different networks or whatnot. But that's kind of how it's still my favorite method.
Well, Angus, if people do have any questions after this episode, is there a good way for them to get in contact with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Just search me up on LinkedIn, Angus Lovitt from Ramp Growth. Message me on LinkedIn, and I'm sure that I'd love to hear from you, and I'm sure I can get back to you.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.